Everything you think you know about your brain might be wrong. What if your mind isn't generating consciousness, but receiving it? Today, we explore the radical idea that your brain is not a factory of thoughts, but an antenna tuned to a vast field of awareness beyond your skull. Every day, we assume our thoughts, memories, and feelings are made inside our brains, that the mind is a byproduct of neurons firing. But what if that assumption is only part of the story? Imagine your brain not as a generator, but as a receiver, an antenna. Like a radio tuned to invisible frequencies, your mind could be picking up consciousness that exists independently of your body. Neurons don't create awareness. They shape, filter, and express it. In this video, we'll explore real-world examples, fascinating neuroscience cases, and philosophical insights that challenge our most basic beliefs about identity, memory, creativity, and even life itself. Get ready to see your brain and reality in a completely new light. Imagine two people sitting late at night, one curious, one skeptical, and the curious one begins by saying, "What if the brain is not the generator of consciousness, but more like an antenna that receives it?" The skeptic immediately responds, "That sounds poetic, but science says the brain produces thought the way the liver produces bile." The curious one smiles and replies, "Science says the brain correlates with thought, not necessarily that it creates it from nothing. Correlation is not the same as origin." The skeptic pauses, and the curious one continues. Think of a radio. When music plays, you can open the radio and find circuits, wires, and electrical activity. If you damage the radio, the music becomes distorted or stops. But no one seriously claims the singer lives inside the radio. The radio modulates, receives, and expresses a signal that exists independently. The skeptic counters, "But we can see neurons firing when people think. We can stimulate the brain and change experience." The answer comes calmly, yes, and when you adjust the tuning knob on a radio, the song changes. When you break the antenna, the signal weakens. That does not mean the broadcast station suddenly vanished or was created by the radio. The conversation deepens as the curious one adds, "Neuroscience shows that mental states map to brain states, but mapping does not equal generation. A television screen lights up differently for a football match than for a documentary. Yet the screen is not the source of the players or the narrator." The skeptic leans forward, "So you're saying consciousness exists outside the brain?" The reply is careful. "I'm saying the brain may act as a filter, receiver, or translator of consciousness, not its ultimate source." This idea isn't new or mystical by default. William James, one of the founders of psychology, suggested the brain could be a reducing valve, limiting a wider consciousness so we can function in a physical world. The skeptic raises an eyebrow. "That sounds speculative." The response is honest. It is a hypothesis, but so is the claim that consciousness emerges from matter alone. We still don't know how subjective experience arises from electrical impulses. That gap is known as the hard problem of consciousness. The curious one offers a real-world analogy. Look at electricity itself. For centuries, humans observed its effects without understanding its nature. Consciousness may be similar, fundamental, not manufactured. The skeptic asks, "But what about brain damage changing personality?" The answer comes smoothly. If you damage a camera lens, the image becomes blurry. That doesn't mean the world itself became blurry. Cases of brain injury show altered expression of consciousness, not necessarily its destruction. The curious one brings up an example. There are documented cases of people with hydrocephalus who had dramatically reduced brain tissue yet lived normal lives. Studied by neurologists like John Lorber. If the brain were purely a generator, we would expect a strict one-to-one relationship between brain volume and consciousness, but reality is messier. The skeptic nods slowly. Still, near-death experiences and such are controversial. The reply is balanced. Yes, and they should be treated carefully. But reports of clear, structured experiences during periods of minimal brain activity raise legitimate questions. Even if we don't accept all interpretations, they challenge the idea that consciousness always depends on active neural firing. The curious one concludes this part softly, so the antenna model doesn't deny the brain's importance. It elevates it. The brain becomes an exquisitely tuned biological interface, shaping, filtering, and localizing a broader field of awareness into a human experience. Just as a radio gives music form, volume, and location, the brain may give consciousness identity, memory, and personality. The skeptic exhales and says, "I don't know if I agree, but I can't say it's illogical." The curious one smiles again. "That's all a good idea needs at first: coherence, humility, and openness." The skeptic sits quietly for a moment, then says, "If consciousness is something received, where does it come from?" The response is calm and grounded. That question sounds strange only because we're used to thinking matter comes first. But physics already accepts fields that exist everywhere, like electromagnetic fields. You cannot see them directly, yet they shape reality. Consciousness could be a similar kind of field, not spatial in the usual sense, but fundamental. The skeptic replies, "Fields still have measurable properties. Consciousness does not." The answer comes gently. Gravity was once only inferred from motion. Its effects were real long before its nature was understood. Consciousness is directly known through experience, even more directly than gravity, but harder to measure from the outside. The skeptic pushes back, "But if consciousness is everywhere, why don't rocks think?" The reply is precise, because reception depends on structure. A radio receives music because it has the right components arranged the right way. A rock does not. A human brain is an extremely complex structure capable of tuning into a rich bandwidth of awareness. The skeptic nods slightly and says, "So evolution built better antennas?" The answer is simple. Possibly. Evolution could be seen as refining biological receivers, allowing more nuanced expression of consciousness. Early life forms might receive only raw sensation. Humans receive abstract thought, self-reflection, and imagination. The skeptic says that still sounds like consciousness grows with brain complexity. The reply clarifies, the range of expression grows, not necessarily the source. Think of internet bandwidth. A faster connection allows higher quality video, not because the video is created by the cable, but because more information passes through. The skeptic then asks, what about artificial intelligence? If we build a complex enough machine, will it receive consciousness too? The answer is careful. That depends on whether consciousness requires biological processes or simply the right kind of organization. This question is open. But notice how we already speak of machines processing information without assuming they experience meaning. Intelligence and consciousness are not the same. The skeptic reflects and says, you're separating awareness from computation. The reply agrees. Exactly. A calculator computes, but it does not feel confused or satisfied. Human thought includes an inner point of view. That inner point is what the antenna model tries to explain. The skeptic brings up a real-world case. People under anesthesia lose consciousness when the brain is suppressed. The response is steady. Yes, because the receiver is temporarily offline. If the antenna is powered down or misaligned, the signal is not expressed. When the brain activity resumes, experience returns. The skeptic counters, but we don't observe consciousness floating around while someone is unconscious. The answer comes softly. We also don't see radio waves with our eyes. Absence of observation is not proof of absence. We infer unseen causes all the time from consistent effects. The skeptic sighs. This feels like it risks becoming unfalsifiable. The reply acknowledges the concern. That's a fair worry. But the materialist view also struggles to explain why electrical activity feels like anything at all. Both views face deep questions. The antenna model simply shifts the mystery rather than pretending it is solved. The skeptic grows thoughtful and says, I admit, it explains why subjective experience feels so immediate and fundamental. The response adds, exactly. Consciousness does not feel like a product. It feels like the ground of experience. The brain-based model says awareness turns on when matter arranges itself correctly. The antenna model says awareness is already there, and the brain gives it shape. The skeptic looks down and murmurs, "And death?" The answer is quiet and respectful. From this perspective, death would be the end of reception, not necessarily the end of consciousness itself. Just as breaking a radio ends the music in that room, not the broadcast. The skeptic remains silent, not convinced, but no longer dismissive, sensing that the idea, while unproven, is internally consistent and deeply challenging. The skeptic finally speaks again and says, "If this idea were true, shouldn't we see clearer evidence?" The response comes patiently. We see hints, not proofs, just as early astronomers saw hints of heliocentrism before they had precise instruments. One hint is that subjective experience cannot be reduced to objective description. You could describe every neural firing in a brain and still not capture what red feels like. The skeptic replies, "That's the famous problem of qualia." The answer agrees, yes, and it remains unresolved. The antenna model explains qualia by saying experience is primary, not derived. The brain selects and structures experience, but does not manufacture its raw feeling. The skeptic asks, what about memory? If consciousness is external, why do memories disappear with brain damage? The reply is clear, because memory storage may depend on the brain, even if awareness does not. Think of a phone connected to the cloud. The connection allows access, but the local device still stores files. Damage the device, and access becomes difficult even though the internet still exists. The skeptic nods and says, so consciousness is the signal, memory is the hardware. The answer responds, that's one way to frame it. The brain may localize consciousness in time, giving it a personal history and identity. The skeptic then challenges, but identity feels continuous. I feel like the same person every day. The response is thoughtful. Continuity does not require generation. A stream flows continuously, but the water itself is always new. Consciousness may flow through changing brain states while preserving a sense of self. The skeptic recalls something and says, meditators often report losing the sense of self. The reply connects the dots. Exactly. In deep meditation, brain activity patterns change, and people report expanded awareness or dissolution of ego. This fits the idea that the brain usually narrows consciousness for survival, and certain states loosen that filter. The skeptic says drugs do the same thing. The answer agrees. Yes, psychedelics often reduce activity in the brain's default mode network, and people report richer, more connected experiences. Interestingly, less brain control sometimes leads to more vivid consciousness, not less. The skeptic pauses, then says, that's counterintuitive if the brain is the generator. The response is gentle. It is. But it makes sense if the brain usually constrains experience, like a valve controlling pressure. The skeptic then asks, why would nature limit consciousness? The answer is practical, because unlimited awareness would be overwhelming. To survive, organisms need focus, boundaries, and filters. A hunter cannot function while experiencing everything at once. The skeptic gives a small smile. So everyday consciousness is a survival mode. The reply says, yes, a very useful one. The antenna is tuned to a narrow band that helps us eat, reproduce, and avoid danger. The skeptic grows serious and asks, does this idea lead to religion? The answer is careful. It doesn't have to. It can remain a philosophical or scientific hypothesis. Some people connect it to spirituality, others to panpsychism, others to information theory. The model itself does not demand belief, only reconsideration. The skeptic leans back and says, I can see why this idea keeps returning in history. The response concludes this part quietly. Ideas return when questions remain unanswered. Until we explain how matter produces meaning or why awareness exists at all, the possibility that the brain is an antenna rather than a generator will continue to challenge how we understand ourselves. The skeptic speaks again with a softer tone and says, if consciousness is filtered, can that filter ever be measured? The response is honest. Not directly, at least not yet. But we already measure its effects. Changes in brain chemistry, electrical rhythms, and network connectivity consistently alter the quality of experience, not its existence. This pattern fits a modulation model better than a creation model. The skeptic asks, can you give a concrete real-world parallel? The answer comes easily. Think about a dimmer switch connected to a light source. The switch does not create light, but it controls brightness. Neuroscience often finds dimmers, not factories. Increase or decrease activity. An experience changes in intensity and form. The skeptic considers this and replies, that still assumes a hidden source. The response is calm. Yes, but physics already assumes hidden sources. Quantum fields underlie particles. Space itself has energy. Reality is not just solid objects. Consciousness may be another foundational layer. The skeptic then challenges, why does consciousness feel private if it's fundamental? The reply explains, because the brain localizes it. The antenna gives consciousness a point of view, a boundary, a narrative. Without that structure, awareness may be diffuse and non-personal. The skeptic nods slowly and says, that would explain why infants don't seem self-aware at first. The answer agrees, exactly. As the brain develops, the receiver becomes more finely tuned. Language, memory, and social interaction shape how consciousness is expressed. The skeptic asks, and animals? The reply is simple, different antennas, different ranges. A bat experiences the world through echolocation. A dog through smell. Their brains tune consciousness into forms we can barely imagine. The skeptic smiles, so reality is richer than human perception. The response says, much richer. We already accept this in physics. We see only a tiny slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. Why assume consciousness is limited to human-style awareness? The skeptic then raises a concern. Could this idea be misused to deny brain science? The reply is firm but fair. It shouldn't be. The antenna model depends on brain science. Without understanding the receiver, the signal remains abstract. Medical treatment, psychology, and neuroscience remain essential. The skeptic says, so mental illness? The answer responds carefully. Mental illness would be a tuning problem, not a moral or spiritual failure. Depression, anxiety, and psychosis reflect altered filtering and signaling, not broken humanity. The skeptic exhales, clearly affected, and says, that's a compassionate way to see it. The response adds, it removes stigma. Just as a damaged radio deserves repair, not blame. The skeptic then asks quietly, what about creativity and insight? The answer flows. Moments of insight often feel like reception, not construction. Artists say ideas arrive. Scientists report sudden clarity after rest. These experiences feel discovered, not assembled. The skeptic laughs softly. I've felt that. The response says those moments fit the antenna metaphor well. When the noise drops, the signal comes through. The skeptic looks thoughtful and concludes, I still don't know if this is true. The reply ends the part gently. You don't need certainty to explore a better question. Sometimes the value of an idea is not that it answers everything, but that it forces us to ask why consciousness exists at all, instead of assuming it is an accident of matter. The skeptic sits in silence for a while and then says, there's something unsettling about this idea. The response is understanding because it challenges control. If consciousness is not produced by the brain, then we are not isolated machines. We are participants in something larger. The skeptic replies, that sounds uncomfortable for modern thinking. The answer agrees. Yes, modern culture values control, predictability, and ownership. The antenna model suggests we do not own consciousness. We host it. The skeptic asks, does that reduce human uniqueness? The reply is thoughtful. It reframes it. Humans may not be unique because we generate awareness, but because we interpret it in a uniquely complex way. A violin does not create music, but it can express it in ways a drum cannot. The skeptic nods and says, so meaning comes from interpretation. The response continues, exactly. The brain shapes raw awareness into stories, values, goals, and emotions. Meaning is not less real because it is shaped. It is real because it is lived. The skeptic then wonders aloud, if this were true, would it change how we live? The answer is quiet but firm. It already has for those who take it seriously. It encourages humility. If consciousness is fundamental, then harming others is not just damaging bodies, but disrupting expressions of the same underlying awareness. The skeptic reflects and says, that sounds like ethics without commandments. The reply smiles, yes. Ethics emerging from shared being rather than imposed rules. The skeptic then challenges, but can this be tested? The response is cautious, not directly yet. But future science may look for signatures of consciousness not tied to local brain activity alone, just as physics once expanded beyond visible matter. The skeptic says, like dark matter. The answer agrees, exactly. We inferred dark matter because gravity behaved strangely. Consciousness behaves strangely too. Subjectivity refuses to disappear under analysis. The skeptic looks thoughtful and asks, what would falsify this idea? The reply is honest. A complete explanation of consciousness that derives experience from physical processes without leftover mystery. If we could explain why pain hurts or why love feels meaningful purely from equations, the antenna model would be unnecessary. The skeptic smiles faintly. That seems far away. The response agrees, very far. Despite massive advances, consciousness remains where physics was before electricity. Powerful, obvious, and poorly understood. The skeptic then says, I notice something. This idea doesn't deny science. It admits ignorance. The reply affirms, yes. It says we don't know yet, instead of we know enough. That posture matters. The skeptic exhales slowly and says, I came in ready to dismiss this as mystical nonsense. The response answers warmly, and you didn't need belief to see its logic. Curiosity is enough. The skeptic looks away and quietly says, if the brain is an antenna, then maybe silence matters more than noise. The reply closes the part gently. That may be the most practical takeaway of all. When a signal is subtle, clarity often comes not from adding more activity, but from learning how to listen. The skeptic breaks the silence again and says, there's one thing still bothering me. The response invites it. Say it. The skeptic continues, if consciousness is received, why does it feel so personal, so tied to this body? The answer comes slowly because the body and brain provide boundaries. Without boundaries, experience would have no center. The antenna does not just receive, it localizes. It gives consciousness a position in space, a timeline, a name. The skeptic replies, so the self is a function of limitation. The response agrees, yes. The self is a useful fiction created by the brain to organize experience. It allows responsibility, memory, and continuity. But awareness itself may be larger than the self it passes through. The skeptic reflects. That explains why people report feeling more alive when the sense of self loosens. The reply says, exactly. When the filter relaxes, awareness expands, even though the body remains the same. The skeptic then asks, why don't we remember that expanded state? The answer is clear, because memory belongs to the brain. The antenna can receive more than it can store. When the structure returns to normal, only fragments remain. The skeptic nods and says, like waking from a dream. The response confirms, yes. The experience felt complete while it happened, but recall is partial. The skeptic then asks, does this imply free will? The answer is careful. It reframes it. Choices may arise from interaction between the signal and the structure. Not absolute freedom, not pure determinism, but participation. The skeptic says, so we are neither puppets nor gods. The response smiles, exactly. We are interpreters. The skeptic pauses and then asks, what about time? Consciousness feels continuous, but physics says time may not be. The reply connects the idea. The brain may slice a timeless awareness into moments. Just as a film projector creates motion from still frames, the brain creates temporal flow from something deeper. The skeptic looks intrigued. That would mean the present moment is more fundamental than past or future. The response answers, many contemplative traditions say exactly that, long before neuroscience existed. The skeptic chuckles, so ancient intuition meets modern confusion. The reply says, yes, and neither replaces the other. They inform each other. The skeptic grows quiet and then says, if this view is right, death might not be the ultimate annihilation people fear. The response stays grounded. It suggests uncertainty, not guarantees. It says the end of bodily function is not automatically the end of awareness, but does not describe what follows. The skeptic nods, unknown, but not meaningless. The reply agrees. Unknown does not equal empty. The skeptic then adds, I notice this idea makes people less afraid of asking big questions. The response answers softly, because it treats consciousness as something worthy of wonder, not just a byproduct to be dismissed. The skeptic looks thoughtful and says, maybe the real mistake was assuming we already understand what it means to be aware. The reply closes this part calmly. That assumption may be the loudest noise of all, drowning out the signal we are trying to understand. The skeptic shifts and says, there's another concern people might raise. The response invites it without pressure. Go on. The skeptic continues, if consciousness is not generated by the brain, does that make science powerless here? The reply is steady. Not powerless, just incomplete. Science excels at studying mechanisms, patterns, and relationships. The antenna model does not reject that. It simply says that the deepest layer of reality may not be entirely mechanical. The skeptic replies, that feels like moving the goalpost. The answer is gentle, or recognizing that the field is larger than the stadium. Science has expanded before. Atoms were once thought indivisible. Space was once thought empty. Each time, humility allowed progress. The skeptic nods and says, so this is an expansion, not a retreat. The response agrees, exactly. It invites neuroscience, physics, and philosophy to talk instead of competing. The skeptic asks, does physics offer anything that supports this? The reply is cautious but clear. Physics already tells us that observation matters. At the quantum level, the observer is not easily separated from the observed. While this does not prove consciousness is fundamental, it shows that reality is not as objective and detached as once believed. The skeptic frowns slightly. People misuse quantum mechanics a lot. The answer acknowledges this. True, and it should not be abused. But it legitimately undermines the idea that reality is purely material and independent of experience. The skeptic thinks and says, so consciousness might be woven into the fabric of reality. The reply answers, that is one serious possibility being explored by philosophers and some physicists, not as mysticism, but as an attempt to solve unsolved problems. The skeptic then asks, if consciousness is fundamental, does it have intention? The response is careful, not necessarily in a human sense. Gravity does not intend to pull objects together, yet it shapes everything. Consciousness could be neutral, expressive rather than purposeful. The skeptic says that avoids turning it into a god. The reply nods, yes. The antenna model does not require deity. It allows one, but does not demand one. The skeptic leans back and says, I can see why materialism became popular. It's simpler. The response answers, simpler, but not always truer. Simplicity is valuable, but not when it erases lived reality. The skeptic then says quietly, you keep returning to experience. The reply explains, because experience is the one thing we cannot doubt. You can doubt theories, senses, and memories, but you cannot doubt that something is being experienced right now. The skeptic nods Descartes. The response adds, yes, but he stopped too soon. He kept the thinker and reduced the rest. The antenna idea asks what thinking itself belongs to. The skeptic grows reflective and says, this changes how suffering is viewed too. The reply answers gently, it does. Suffering becomes a distortion of experience, not proof that existence is meaningless. Pain still hurts, but it is not the final truth about reality. The skeptic sighs, that's strangely comforting. The response says, because it separates the condition from the essence. The skeptic looks thoughtful and concludes this part by saying, even if this idea turns out to be wrong, it treats consciousness with the seriousness it deserves. The reply ends calmly. And sometimes that respect is the first step toward understanding, whether the antenna is real or simply a bridge that helps us think beyond old assumptions. The skeptic sits forward again and says, there's a practical question I can't ignore. The response invites it calmly. What is it? The skeptic continues, if people start believing the brain is only an antenna, couldn't they stop taking responsibility for their actions? The answer is immediate and clear, only if the idea is misunderstood. The antenna model does not remove responsibility. It explains it. The brain is still the instrument through which choices are expressed. If an instrument is poorly tuned, the output suffers, and fixing it remains our duty. The skeptic replies, so ethics still apply. The response agrees, absolutely. If anything, ethics deepen. If awareness is shared at a fundamental level, then every action echoes beyond a single body. The skeptic nods and says, that makes accountability internal, not imposed. The reply answers, yes. Responsibility comes from participation, not fear. The skeptic then asks, how would education change under this view? The response thinks carefully. Education would focus less on stuffing information and more on clarity, attention, and integration. A well-tuned mind learns faster than an overloaded one. The skeptic smiles. That sounds like attention training. The reply agrees. Exactly. Attention is how the antenna is aimed. The skeptic then asks, and technology? The response is balanced. Technology already shapes our tuning. Constant noise, notifications, and stimulation fragment attention. This does not destroy consciousness, but it distorts how it is received. The skeptic says, so distraction is signal interference. The reply answers, that's a good way to put it. Silence, rest, and reflection reduce interference. The skeptic then asks, is that why solitude feels restorative? The response says, yes. When external noise drops, internal coherence increases. The skeptic pauses and then says, this idea also explains why people chase meaning. The reply responds, because meaning is not manufactured by logic alone. It is sensed. When the signal feels blocked, people feel empty even if their lives look successful. The skeptic nods slowly. That describes modern anxiety very well. The response answers, many people are not broken. They are misaligned. The skeptic then asks, does this make happiness the goal? The reply clarifies, not happiness as pleasure, but coherence. When the signal and the structure align, satisfaction follows naturally. The skeptic reflects and says, this makes mental health less about fixing flaws and more about restoring balance. The response agrees, yes. Therapy becomes tuning, not judgment. The skeptic looks thoughtful and says, I see now why this idea keeps resurfacing in different forms. The reply answers, because it speaks to lived experience without denying science. The skeptic exhales and concludes this part quietly. It doesn't give easy answers, but it gives a wider frame to place our questions in. The skeptic sits back, no longer tense, and says, so after all this, what is the result of the debate? The response does not rush. The result is not a verdict, but a shift. The skeptic asks, a shift toward what? The answer comes clearly, toward recognizing that consciousness is not a small problem at the edge of science, but the center of human understanding. The skeptic nods and says, so the antenna idea wins? The reply is honest. It doesn't win. It survives. It remains standing after criticism, which is more important than victory. The skeptic reflects, materialism explains many things well, but not experience itself. The response agrees, yes. And the antenna model explains experience without denying the brain's role. It reframes the brain from a producer to a mediator. The skeptic says, so the debate reveals limits, not failures. The reply answers, exactly. It shows where our knowledge ends and where humility begins. The skeptic then adds, and it changes how we see ourselves. The response continues, we are not isolated sparks in a dead universe, nor are we magical exceptions to nature. We are points of contact where something deeper meets biology. The skeptic says quietly, that's a powerful image. The reply goes on, it suggests that meaning is not something we invent to cope, but something we encounter through participation. The skeptic pauses and says, so the real outcome is not proof, but perspective. The response agrees, yes. The antenna model invites openness. It asks us to study the brain carefully while respecting the mystery of awareness. The skeptic looks thoughtful and says, it also explains why consciousness feels both fragile and profound. The reply answers, fragile in expression, profound in essence. The skeptic then asks one last question. If you had to summarize the final thought in one sentence, what would it be? The response answers slowly and clearly. The brain may shape consciousness the way a lens shapes light, but light itself does not begin at the lens. The skeptic smiles faintly and says, I can live with that uncertainty. The response closes calmly. And that may be the most honest result of all. Not certainty, but a deeper respect for the fact that something is experiencing this moment at all.